I don't know. I think that it's a real serious problem that we need to take seriously.
Why?
And
Why do you say that?
do what?
Cam, why do you
Oh,
say that? Why do you say that?
what?
Uh-huh.
Whoa, spicy. It looks like there might be some heated disagreement between these apologists. Jon McCray ain't happy with Cameron Batuzzi.
Cam, why do you say
Oh,
that?
why?
Why do you say that?
So grab your popcorn, my fellow apes, as we're gonna take a gander.
What?
Uh-huh.
I feel your sigh, Cameron. Alright, a bit of context. Our clip today comes from a live stream that Mike Winger, Jon McCray, Cameron Batuzzi, and Braxton Hunter made responding to our friend, Genetically Modified Skeptic. Let's take a look at what Drew had to say.
If God couldn't create a food cycle for all creatures that didn't include suffering, then he isn't omnipotent. If he didn't know the system would lead to suffering, he isn't omniscient. Now, if he could have done better, if he could have made a food cycle that didn't promote suffering, but chose not to, he's not only lacking in omnibenevolence, but I would argue he's a sadist.
As seen, Drew McCoy made a video in which he specified several reasons for his disbelief in God, leading to a trio of apologists to argue against his stance. Drawing from Epicurus, Drew outlined the problem of evil, and at some point he put special emphasis on the suffering of creatures. You know, the poor koalas that burn to death in forest fires, or the countless dinosaurs that God decided to throw a giant rock at. Drew argued that if God could not create a world without the suffering of innocent creatures, it suggests that God is not all-powerful. Furthermore, if God is unaware of this suffering, it implies that he is not all-knowing. Lastly, if God could have designed a cycle devoid of suffering but chose not to, this indicates that he is not all-loving.
Release the plague, Jeffrey.
It's a classic argument that stood the test of time.
Why do you say that?
Because it has stood the test of time, John. If the universe was created by an all-powerful, all-loving God, it would be surprising to find a world in which innocent creatures suffer horrendously and yet don't receive compensation.
So first off, this is what kind of reveals to me more that Drew probably isn't familiar with the biblical literature.
That a boy, John. Anyone who finds the problem of evil compelling is just biblically illiterate, right? Otherwise, they'd have your view, and indeed your confidence. But I cut you off. My bad. Let's rewind.
So first off, this is what kind of reveals to me more that Drew probably isn't familiar with the biblical literature, because it seems to ignore the fact that God did create a food cycle that didn't include suffering, right?
Really? John's defense requires us to buy a literal interpretation of Genesis. But, my dude, what if we're not stuck in the 18th century? What about those who refuse to forego the use of the brain that God apparently gave them, John? But sure, if we simply hand-wave away the mountains of evidence of creatures roaming the earth long before we turned up, we can follow along. If we embrace a remarkably simplified version of the Garden of Eden, a view that, to be fair to John, is painfully still common among American Christians, then okay, this suggests that there was once a state in which all animals, including humans, didn't need flesh to survive. But notice, crucially, that this doesn't say that non-human animals didn't experience pain. Indeed, even if we ignore all of the evidence before us and toss our critical faculties into the abyss, John still has all of his work ahead of him. So far, then, John wants us to buy a massive ontological commitment that contradicts all of the data and yet provides no explanatory value.
We all know this, and then the fall happened, and then that's what changed the world.
Ah yes, the fall. You know, one would expect that a program advancing from beta to the official release under the guidance of a perfect programmer would be free of deficits, right? Does it not strike you as profoundly cruel that God would express anger towards Adam and Eve for their decision to eat from a tree, of which they were ignorant of the consequences, a tree that he himself placed before them, only to react by condemning all other species? Ignoring the crime, God chose to punish not only some innocents, but all innocents. Worse still, he punishes many of the sentient creatures by moulding them so that they absolutely must violently consume other sentient beings to survive. This is why the Bible isn't taken seriously in philosophy. It isn't even remotely logical. The stories require us to ignore overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and yet they still fail to account for the data. And look, as we're seeing here, it's always expressed with such overwhelming confidence and condescension.
This is what kind of reveals to me more that Drew probably isn't familiar with the biblical literature.
And talking of biblical literacy, here's a juicy slice of irony for you. Despite Jon painting a picture of some animals needing to eat flesh to survive as a consequence of the fall of Adam and Eve,
We all know this, and then the fall happened.
scholars and theologians do not infer that predation commenced after the fall, but rather after the flood. Indeed, it's after the flood that we can make this inference.
This is what kind of reveals to me more that Drew probably isn't familiar with the biblical literature.
But please, do continue, Jon.
It says, and God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And then verse 30, and every beast on the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so.
Jon, Drew has articulated a strong doubt regarding the likelihood of an all-loving God allowing sentient beings to endure gratuitous suffering, and so what's needed here is a compelling explanation for this troubling discrepancy. As we've noted, embracing religious narratives often means sidelining archaeological findings, and so we'll play along for the sake of the argument. Indeed, we're turned to scripture. Notice that the verses that Jon referenced do not deny animal suffering, but merely state that all animals were initially herbivores. But even if we buy this, the question remains: what justifiable reason could an all-loving deity have for converting herbivores into carnivores? And why some? Why not others? Why does the chicken deserve to be the meal of the fox? Per biblical teaching, non-human animals don't have free will, so why instill in these creatures the ability to experience pain and suffering, and then enslave them to us cruel idiots? Look, the fall is explicit about sin's entrance into the world, necessitating atonement through faith and religious commitment. So what remedy do the animals have for their suffering? Furthermore, when Jesus supposedly died for human sins, did all non-human animals just get the short end of the stick, doomed to suffer for human sins, without hope for salvation, and left in anguish even as humans receive redemption through Jesus? All non-human animals are cursed to suffer for man's deeds and excluded from eternal rewards. Why? How is this just or merciful? Is it not clear, Jon? Your answer makes things worse. Far worse.
So initially, yes, we weren't set up to eat animals, right? And so this is a result of the fall.
Here's a thought. If eating flesh is the result of sin, why aren't you vegan, Jon? If your answer to animal suffering is that it's our fault, why do you perpetuate it? Anyhow, this is the problem with creationists. They deny mountains of evidence, yet have the audacity to dismiss others as lacking grace.
Drew probably isn't familiar with the biblical literature.
Turning away from scripture and back to reality, it would be remiss not to emphasize that the evidence overwhelmingly supports meat eating as a fundamental aspect of life that dates back at least 800 million years to the earliest multicellular organisms. The evidence has been conclusive for a very long time, gentlemen. But I'm not the only one who's unimpressed with Jon's dismissive response. Cameron Bertuzzi seems to better recognise the significance of this objection.
I think they can be seen more poignantly when you talk about animal pain, because it does seem to involve unjustified pain and suffering. Whether or not you want to call it suffering or pain or whatever it is, it's still a bad state of affairs. I think we are pretty much all agreed on that. If you see your dog in pain, that's still like a bad state of affairs. You'd rather that not happen. So the question is still like this pain and suffering, it does still seem to sort of conflict with theism. So all I'm saying is that I think we just need to take it seriously.
And it's here that we get to the clip that I showed you at the beginning of this video.
I don't know. I think that it's a real serious problem that we need to take seriously.
Why?
And
why do you say that?
do what?
Cam, why do you say that?
Why?
Why do you say that?
Because he's using his brain. It always surprises me that so many theists so easily dismiss the problem of evil like Jon here, and so we've got to give credit where credit is due. Fair play, Cameron. When it comes to a proposition we believe in, we tend to have very little issue admitting that there's some data that is better expected on different models. But when it comes to religion, theists tend to be so outrageously blind, they're so eager to defend their faith that they refuse to recognize that some data simply is more expected on a different model. And that's what we're seeing here. Cameron has the humility to recognize that there is some evidence and some observations that are more expected on atheism, or at the very least, they're very surprising on traditional theism. Whereas Jon is imbuing Christian confidence that is deserving of little more than cringe.
Damn, why do you say that? Why do you say that?
Despite Jon's dismissal, the problem of animal suffering remains a serious theological issue that cannot be lightly brushed aside. First, we don't live in a literal biblical world in which it's only the year 6000 and all descendants are from Adam and Eve, which means that the sheer scale of animal suffering over hundreds of millions of years is staggering. Billions of sentient creatures have endured immense anguish through predation, disease, injuries, starvation, and natural disasters. This is extremely difficult to reconcile with an all-loving, all-powerful creator. Second, even in a literal biblical worldview, non-human animals are innocent. They have not sinned or transgressed divine law. So, appealing to the fall of human sin does not adequately explain why animals should suffer for our misdeeds. It is seemingly, overwhelmingly seemingly, unjust for God to condemn all creatures based on the actions of humans. Unlike humans, other animals do not have immortal souls, free will, or the hope for eternal salvation, so their suffering is not redeemed in an afterlife. It is utterly gratuitous and meaningless if there is no greater purpose behind it. You know, I would go so far as to say that Jon's answer is not only intellectually bankrupt, but it's critically devoid of basic empathy, and it's almost funny for him to claim that Drew is the illiterate one. Now, they touch upon other supposed explanations for animal suffering, and to that end, we will be coming back to this conversation to see what the other apologists had to say. So subscribe and stay tuned. Thanks.
We all know this, and then the fall happened.